You don't need more than 10 rounds in a magazine to kill a deer. I agree with that statement. In fact, how many rounds do you need? There's the question. There's the question that's on the minds of everybody in the gun control debate right now, because focus is shifting away from this assault weapons ban to magazine capacity. So we're going to focus on that question. Do you need 10 rounds? Do you need 5 rounds? Do you need 15 rounds? How many rounds do you need? New York just passed the 7-round limit. So you can carry 7 rounds in New York. 1 in the chamber would give you 8. Other states allow you to carry 10 rounds. A few others limit it to 20, and then the vast majority of states don't have a limit for general purpose with a firearm. Now, for specific purposes, a lot of states do have limits. And those limits come from a single question. How many rounds does it take to accomplish your goal? How many rounds does it take to accomplish your goal? That's how many rounds you need. Well, what is your goal? For a lot of people, the deer hunting question comes into play. Most natural resource departments that I know of limit the number of rounds to 5 for hunting white-tailed deer. At least they do in my home state. For bird hunting, it is generally 3 rounds. So that's how many rounds you need for that specific sporting purpose. That very specific task of hunting white-tailed deer during firearm deer season, or hunting quail or other bird game during that specific hunting season. At that point, there is a defined limit on rounds based on gaming law. Now, there are other ways that you can define the limit of how many rounds do you need. Again, how many rounds does it take to accomplish your task? Action shooting, for example, IPSC, 3-gun, IDPA, the matches themselves define how many rounds you need. A general IDPA match, for example, will be between 100 and 150 rounds. Depending on the firearm you're using for that match, you're going to be limited to 10 rounds in a magazine or 8 rounds in a magazine, and then 1 in the chamber to start the match, except for a very specific scenario where you may be further limited than that. Again, specific sporting scenario, a specific defined single event limits that capacity. Well, say you're not deer hunting, say you're not hunting at all, and say you're not participating in one of what is known as the action shooting sports. So you're at that point, in a general purpose mode. And there are basically 2 general purposes for the firearm. You have recreational purposes, what's often defined as plinking, and then you have self-defense, whether that's defense of you, defense of your family, defense of a stranger, which is covered under law, or defense of the community. So you have recreation and defense. Well, recreation, there really is no defined limit on how many rounds you need. It's for fun, it's for pleasure. So that leaves defense. What's a reasonable number of rounds for self-defense? Well, again, ask the question, how many rounds do you need to accomplish the task? Well, what is the task? The task is to stop a threat. So there is the question that all this debate is going around. That is the question. How many rounds does it take to stop a threat? So where's our magazine limit going to come from this? What's the reasonable limit? If you look at defensive gun uses, if you look at the vast majority, if you take the established estimates from the various studies, you get somewhere between 800,000 and 2.5 million defensive gun uses per year. And whether you subscribe to the low number, the high number, or somewhere in the middle, it really doesn't matter. And then you take a look at the number of justifiable homicides, both from police officers and civilians, and you get a number that's just under 1,000. So just taking those numbers alone and correlating it, the number of rounds averagely used in a defensive gun use is rather low. It's often 0. In many cases it's 1, 3, 5, 6. In the case recently with the mother who defended her children in the attic. She fired 6 rounds, and it was able to stop the threat. But how many rounds is reasonable? How many rounds does it take to stop a threat? And there's only one answer that covers all scenarios, that protects everyone. How many rounds does it take to stop a threat? It takes as many as it takes, folks. You can't put a number on it. You can't define every scenario. You can look at the numbers, you can look at, what is average, but what is average isn't necessarily and isn't what is reasonable. Because if you take an average and then you make that the law, everybody who needs more than that average number of rounds is screwed. They didn't have enough. So looking at DGUs, what is a decent number of rounds? We've looked, the vast majority, 0. Some of them 1, some of them 5, 10. These are a lot of places the magazine limits. How about 650? Is 650 a reasonable number? Well, you might be asking, okay, what army are you fighting that it takes 650 rounds to stop this threat? Well, folks, it wasn't an army. It was the North Hollywood shootout. 650 rounds from law enforcement. 650 to stop 2 people. 2 people. 650 rounds to stop that threat. On top of that, they had to go into civilian gun shops and take the high-powered rifles, the AR-15s, off the wall to stop these guys because their duty firearms weren't getting the job done. So it was civilian firearms that stopped that threat. Now, I'm not saying that every criminal you're going to come across or every threat you're going to come across is going to be a heavily armored individual with an illegally modified firearm. But the fact that it's happened in the past means it can happen again. And in fact, it's more likely to happen again because there's already a blueprint there for someone to utilize. So how many rounds does it take to stop a threat? I can't answer that, and neither can the government. Magazine limits don't make sense. It's up to the individual. It's up to the individual who has the individual right to bear arms to define for themselves how many rounds they're going to carry for protection.